Okay, so I think the floor is ours now. So my name is Julie Billot. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and sociology here at the Graduate Institute. And for this panel discussion, I have the honor of having with me Professor Riccardo Bocco, who is an emeritus professor of political sociology from the Graduate Institute and an expert of the Middle East. And next to me, Professor Cyrus, Schayegh, who is also professor of international history and politics here, also at the Graduate Institute, and also the chair of the department now, and he's the author of The Middle East and the Making of the Modern World, which came out with Harvard in 2017. Right, so to start this discussion, I have a few questions for you. And the first one I would like to ask is related to the support of Western power to the Zionist project. What I found very striking in the movie is the fact that Zionism as an ideology, as a colonial ideology, but also as an ethno-nationalist project, has evolved over time, but became really an actionable project thanks to the support of Western powers. And I think, it is argued in the movie that Zionism could not have succeeded, indeed, without this external support. So could you tell us a bit more about the role of foreign Western powers and the role they played in the ultimate success of an ideology that initially was not received very positively by most Jews across the world. So how did the West make that ideology become, actually actionable? And I'm also interested in the role played by Christian Zionism, which is mentioned a number of times in the movie, but which is not very much explained. So I would like to use your expertise here to tell us a bit more about Christian Zionism.
I think that this documentary, thanks to Romet Vider, is very relevant to understand the situation today. Because there are different patterns of behavior in international relations between what happened at the time and what is happening today. Now, to go to your question, as Shlomo Sand said in the documentary, Europe was confronted with a problem of Jewish migrants that had to escape pogroms in Russia, and progressively, at the end of the 19th century, were moving west. In a different but similar way is a problem that Europe is confronted today. What to do with all the migrants from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, parts of Africa who come over to Europe to seek refuge? We are in another world, meaning that at the time, not only you didn't have the 1951 Geneva Convention for refugees, but on top, in the specific case of the Jews, there was not a Jewish state anywhere where they could be sent back. So how to deal, first of all, with a population management of migrants invading, inverted commas, Western Europe. In a framework of, which was very well explained in the documentary, of mounting nationalism. And the Jews were excluded or partly decided also to exclude themselves. But the symbolic effect of the Dreyfus case in France was a clear, let's say, refusal by most European states of the existence of the Jews. Shlomo Sender recalls the anti-Jewish immigration law. Can you imagine that in 1924, California issued the law against Jewish immigration? 1924, California. Almost like today. Anyway, the documentary again has very well explained that the interest, the imperial interest of the European imperial powers, the United Kingdom first and foremost, in securing through Palestine, Iraq, and at the time Transjordan, that became a separate mandate only in 1928. Until 1928, Transjordan was part of the Palestine mandate under the British. But that, for Great Britain, constituted a key, let's say, tool, not only for trade, oil, access to the India and its colonial and its colonies, but it meant also the reaffirmation, particularly after the First World War, which actually began to show the progressive decadence of the British Empire. This was a reaffirmation of imperial power, definitely, for the United Kingdom. So the point that seems to me as my last point at this stage is that this morning, which I loved the panel this morning and the debates, is that we have been talking about Zionism and the Jewish state. But the point is that there is no definition of what a Jewish state is. And until today, it has not been defined. Why? In 1948, when the Jewish state was created, and Ben-Gurion was confronted to the issue, do we write a constitution? This was going to constitute a menace to the unity of the Jews in Palestine, because different currents in Palestine were disputing with or without religious arguments the definition of a Jewish state. So Ben-Gurion opted for not having a constitution. Until today, Israel doesn't have a constitution. They have an organic law that has been amended 13 times. The last one was August 2018. We will come back eventually on that because it was the new nationality law. So, no constitution, no definition of what a Jewish state means, and leaving a diversity of Zionist trends to emerge, develop. One took over, was the one by Jabotinsky. But let's not forget that in 1946, there was a Zionist Jew from Germany His name was Martin Buber, a famous philosopher, German philosopher. Martin Buber, in 1946, wrote a very seminal book titled The Binational State. Actually, Buber, who declared himself a Zionist, but not a political Zionist a la Jabotinsky, with a number of other people like him who had migrated to Mandate Palestine, begin to question how a project of coexistence could be possible. Plenty of things to say, but I stop here.
I was going to ask you about that later on, but yeah. But what about the Christian Jews? And maybe you can Christian Zionism. Sorry, can you maybe tell us about that then, Cyrus?
Sure, but let me first pivot back to the original question and make a few points. That throughout the modern period, and actually before as well, colonial powers, whether those coming from Europe or elsewhere, have always had the need to work with local people together. You could never have a colonial project that was only and exclusively based on violence. This does not work. Palestine is a particular instance of this broad pattern. Why is it particular? Because the people with whom Britain decided to work together were not quite all there yet, number one. And number two, because basically the bigger part of the people who were supposed to come came from the same broad region as Britain itself, namely Europe. This meant in turn that you had a sort of a very ambiguous relationship when you were a Brit towards those Jewish Zionist people with whom you worked together. They somehow were like you. They spoke your languages. They ate the same things you did. They were, again, basically partly were part of your own societies. But on the other side, they were the other. They were not Christians, they were Jews. Now, in a really interesting way, but we're not going to get into this, Zionist Jews themselves internalized the self and other sort of dichotomy as well. But we, again, shouldn't go into this because this is not your question. Now, the second thing that I want to say about the importance of foreign powers is something very self-evident. And that's the fact, mentioned in the film, that certainly early on, so let's say just around the First World War, there was a very small minority of the population in Palestine that was Jewish, and not all of those Jews were Zionists. And even in 1947, it was still only a third of the population that was Jewish. That in turn meant that you really needed a big power to back you up. And this really was something that was recognized by a key strand of Zionism called diplomatic Zionism from the very start. These were the people like Herzl, who from the start believed that first we need to get a big power to back us up, and only then can we really start to settle. Another strand was cultural Zionism, you somehow touched on this, and yet another one was practical Zionism, which basically said that no, let's not wait, let's force the hand of the foreigners and basically start settling in one way or another and create fait accompli on the ground, things will follow. In reality, most people were not either this or that, these are archetypes, but some sort of combination of these different things together. Next, quick point, I have one or two more and then I'll get to our dear Christians. Next point would be to say that, and this is really important, that not only Western European powers and the United States were working in support. At the crucial moment, the Soviet Union did as well. And that was, of course, the 1947, basically vote at the UN, right? The United States, the Soviet Union did for its own political reasons, which turned out to not be correct. They thought that if they would do so, it would basically help them to keep a foot in Israeli politics and to be able to perhaps, continue to influence the state in one way or another. But the Soviet Union certainly, played a certain role as well at the key moment. The last point that I want to say, now we're really jumping forward in time. From that point in time onwards, from the 1940s, then a little bit more in the 50s, a little bit more in the 60s with Kennedy, and then definitely since 1967, the big victory of Israel over a lot of different Arab armies, the United States became the de facto protector of Israel in the world. What does this mean? As you all know, I'm not saying anything nobody doesn't know. It meant not only military support, it also meant, as importantly, political and financial support, and diplomatic one as well at the UN, which was really important. Now, very interestingly, although this is in principle a very lopsided relationship, because we have a superpower here and a sort of a client of a superpower, although this is the case for a number of different reasons, and I will talk a bit more about what this actually means in a second, for different reasons, Israel, the longer the more, and this is definitely where we are now, developed expertises and connections, expertises of a regional nature, of a technological nature, of a military nature, and connection of a social and a cultural and political nature in the United States that made it a key partner for the US. So anybody who thinks that this is really a lopsided relationship should reconsider. The US really needs, ultimately, the Israelis need the US more than vice versa, but in practice, the United States, at the very least, believes, and in some ways, if it continues to have the policies it does, actually does need Israel in really important ways, right? Now, last sort of thing I want to add before I move on to the Christians, Israelis, until this very day, are extremely sensitive, like a seismograph, like a very, very developed seismograph, to any small change in American elite and public opinion about Israeli politics. You will have literally newspaper articles, headlines on page 1, talking about the question whether the US president did or did not pick up the phone when Netanyahu called. Okay, I'm not joking, okay? The question, do we have the ear, are they going to still be in our corner, is absolutely not simply vital, but literally existential, okay? Now, that sort of gets us to the Christian Zionists. And I don't know, honestly speaking, too much about them. This is not my specialty. So I'd be happy to, afterwards hand over to you again, Riccardo. But the one thing that I certainly can say is that for their own very good, ultimately, fundamentally anti-Semitic reason, they do believe that it is for theological reasons, right, that have to do with the end of the days and, the coming of, Jesus Christ, it is important to support Israel to the hilt. Now, what's really interesting about this is, I would say, if you look at it sort of from a macro-historical perspective, 100 years, right, is two facts. One fact is that there were actually different types of these Christian Zionists. So not everybody exactly was doing and saying the same thing, which is basically almost always the case. So one shouldn't overemphasize homogeneity a little bit too much. And the other thing that I think really important is that the relative importance of this support in the United States for US governmental support has probably become more hefty in the last 50 years. Meaning it was less important, let's say 50 years ago, it is probably everything else considered more important now. But, and this is I think really important, again, let us not kid ourselves, okay? Even without that support, Israel would still, Israel would still have a very, very solid support of an institutional political nature in a big part of the political elite and also in the military elite in the United States. I think that is only partially reducible to this question of the ideological support of, Christian Zionists. Riccardo.
Just a footnote to what he just said. Today, figures about the number of Christian Zionists in the States seems to be between 25 and 30%, anyway, of the voters. And the other important point of what Cyrus said is that part of the Christian Zionists believe that once Israel will have freed Palestine from Muslims, the time will come where either the Jews will convert to Christianity or they will be killed, which every year creates a number of quarrels between rabbis in Israel and leaders of the Christian Zionist trend in the US.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important, to keep in mind this diversity of Zionisms. I think that's something that is very striking also in the film. And so I want to go back to this period of the 1930s, 1940s, where there is this fragmentation and gradual radicalization of the Zionist movement during the British Mandate, with the right-wing fringe of the movement turning against the British, notably as a result of this white paper putting Jewish immigration to Palestine on hold in 1939, right? And so we see at that point different radical groups emerging, notably the Stern Gang, Etzel, the Lehi movement, as well as paramilitary organization such as Haganah, which formed the nucleus of the current, of the later IDF. And so I would like you to tell me a little bit more about these extreme rights groups, what have been their influence when, on the institution of the State of Israel in the early days, and what have they become, over time? What influence did they play in the early days of the Israeli state?
Shall I go first this time? So let's again start with the basic. The basic is that these, let's call them really right-wing Zionist groups, are ultimately in the big scheme of the things, like through the 1940s, maybe certainly until 1947, 48, they're ultimately a sideshow, okay? They're not ultimately what matters most. And I do want to start by saying what matters most. What matters most is the fact that from the mid-20s, and definitely from the late 20s, early 30s, what becomes the fusion of two different, let's call them socialist, nationalist groups, parties, into one bigger party, which later on becomes the Labour Party, let's just call it Labour Party, becomes hegemonic in Mandate Palestine, in the Yishuv itself, the Yishuv being basically the Zionist settlement in Palestine. Around the same point in time, around 1930, you also have something else that's going on, which is the fact that the overall ultimate political gravity point of the Zionist movement, politically speaking, moves from Europe to Palestine. Before, this is not really the case. Before, it's a little bit here and a little bit there, but around 1930, it really sort of moves to Palestine. These things go together. Now, why is this important? For a variety of different reasons. So the Labour Party, in which Ben-Gurion is leading, but there are other people as well, is not just some party. It's basically an institution that, firstly, is at the center of what you can only call a parastate organization. And that's the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency of today is basically the inheritor of that thing, but at that point in time, it's really like a parastate. It's a state in the state. It's recognized in the Mandate Charter of 1922. It is recognized by the British. If you go to its archives, you will immediately see that it basically functions like any government. It has ministries, I mean, from A to Z. And the Labour Party is quite central in that government, basically in that parastate government. It has also links to labor unions. That's basically, it like is a labor union as well. Not quite is, but it has very strong links to it. And it starts in the mid-1930s to build up the Haganah. And compared to the Haganah, these other groups that we mentioned, it's like peanuts, like ultimately, okay? They matter somewhat, but they are much less important. It's the Haganah that really counts, partly because they actually work with the British, okay? And they continue to work with the British, I think, definitely until the mid-1940s. So this is the big story, right? And the big story is how people inside this party, and by extension inside these different institutions that the Yishuv is able to build up with British support, and because the British need them, right, are able to grab more and more land or buy more and more land, get more and more people into the country, create economic structures that are Jewish only, at the very least to a degree, are able to execute a military buildup, and so on and so forth. All sorts of really fundamental processes that you need to carry out if you want to start building a state. Now, we should perhaps also mention that by, at the very least, the ideas of some historians, maybe until the early 1930s, as late as that, it wasn't really entirely clear whether this new country would become fully and totally independent from Britain. There's a great book by Dmitry Shumsky who has written about this. I actually pretty much agree with what he's saying, because it makes sense in a larger world of empires very much. I don't know about the exact details, but it's an interesting sort of story in and by itself. But no matter whether what exact international legal status Israel was supposed to have, it had an institutional development like basically almost nothing else. Did I mention there was a parliament? There was one. Okay, just to add to everything else, okay, which actually worked in a pretty democratic way, in a very, I mean, without women. I don't know whether women were allowed to vote or not. At any rate, I mean, institution building is like the A and the O. Now, let me answer the question that you asked yourself. Were these other fringe right-wing groups, were they important? Yes, I think they were to a degree. Certainly in 1947, 1948, in some parts of the fighting that happened in 1948, Etzel played an important role. I mean, Lech is like nothing, literally. It's like a bunch of people running around and trying to kill, like, you know, a British officer there, and this is it. It's more symbolic, right? In real terms, like on the ground. And let's not forget, there was a direct confrontation between the Haganah and Etzel in 1947, 1948, right? There's the famous Altalena, you know, incident, which basically boiled down to the Haganah becoming the state and saying, we are going to integrate you into our new military and political structure rather than the other way around. We're not going to have a situation here where there are paramilitary organizations running around. and which is the ultimate proof that this bottom line was a sideshow, rather than part of what really, truly sort of mattered. Yeah.
Thank you.
I do agree. Just I would add a couple of dimensions. The first one is the fact that a majority of Zionist Jews, rather on the Jabotinsky line, were all Ashkenazi. And the so-called Socialist Party, Labour Party, who took over from 1949 until 1977, when Menachem Begin came to power, they were constituting the Ashkenazi elite, and actually Begin, who was not a Mizrahim, not a Sephardi Jew, he understood that to win the elections for the Likud, he had to ally with the Mizrahim, who had been, until then, victims of forms of soft apartheid by the Ashkenazi. So finally, the Mizrahim had the place and the space. And then we can debate about also, maybe you were hinting at cultural aspect when I was talking about religion. That was what you meant?
More Buber.
Buber?
I mean,
yeah, the political project.
Yeah. He's not a really good example of cultural Zionism, actually. There are others.
No, exactly. Okay. So, to go back to my point, you have this divide, Ashkenazi Mizrahim, who in the mandate period doesn't play really a key role, because the local Jewish community pre-existing the British mandate, they were quite in good relationship with the Arab population. They were not much part of a Zionist project that it was elaborated at the beginning of the 20th century. Also, because one important point to know, after all what we said, is that the choice of Palestine for a Jewish state came up only during the 5th National Jewish Congress, not before. Before, different places were aired, as the documentary mentions particularly well. And the second point I wanted to make concerning the mandate and after. This morning we aired questions related to left-wing and right-wing political stance, political parties. When it comes to the Palestinians, I don't think we can differentiate much between left and right, as if the left was going to be a supporter of the Palestinians for human rights or whatever. This is really in the air. Actually, to be frank, I prefer somebody like Sharon. Sharon was telling you, I will do A, B, C, and D, and he was doing it. But when you come to most of the labor leaders, they tell you something and they do the opposite. Who was the guy that during the Oslo process built more colonies than ever? Labor guy, remember me his name? Prime Minister Barak, Ehud Barak, socialist labor leader. So left and right, I don't think are they are definitely appropriate if we debate inside Jewish Israeli society. There they make full sense. But if we try to see a difference between left and right when we deal with the Palestinians and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, sorry, I don't see it much. Exception made for the old Communist Party, Israeli Communist Party, or I mean, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think we will close the panel now. Thanks so much. I also want to thank the MENA Initiative at the Institute for organizing this great conference. Thanks so much. Yeah.